forgotten Ice King of the North. In the far reaches of the world, where the auroras painted the sky in ribbons of emerald and violet, there existed a kingdom that time itself seemed reluctant to remember. The land stretched across frozen tundras and mountains of crystalline ice that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 dancing prisms. This was the domain of Iscaran the Pale, a ruler whose name had been whispered in awe and terror for generations, though now those whispers had faded into the howling winds that swept across his desolate realm. Iscaran had not always been forgotten. Once, his kingdom of Norvengard had been a jewel among the northern territories, a place where artisans crafted sculptures from ice that never melted, and where merchants travelled from distant lands to trade in furs so white they seemed spun from clouds. The capital city, Crystal Haven, had risen from the permafrost like a crown of frozen stars, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if in defiance of the harsh climate that sought to crush all life beneath its weight. In those days, Iscaran had been called the Just, the Wise, the Guardian of the Eternal Winter. His people had loved him, for he had brought prosperity to a land where survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. But that was before the curse, before the long silence, before the world turned its back on the Ice King and his frozen domain. Now, 3 centuries after his disappearance from the annals of history, Iscaran sat alone in his throne room, a vast chamber carved from a single glacier that had stood for millennia. The throne itself was a masterwork of nature and magic combined, formed from ice that blazed with an inner light, neither warm nor cold, but something in between, something that existed outside the normal laws of temperature and time. The Ice King's appearance reflected the centuries of isolation that had consumed him. His hair, once golden like the brief summer sun that graced these lands, had turned to pure white, flowing past his shoulders in waves that seemed to move with a wind that wasn't there. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of ancient ice, pale blue veins visible beneath the surface, like rivers frozen in time. His eyes, however, remained unchanged, a deep blue that held the colour of the deepest ocean, still sharp and aware despite the weight of 300 years of solitude. He wore robes of white fur and silver thread, garments that had not aged because nothing in his kingdom aged anymore, suspended as it was in a moment that refused to end. Iscaran rose from his throne, his movements fluid despite the ages he had sat there. He walked to one of the great windows that lined the throne room, each pane made from ice so clear it might have been glass, had glass been able to withstand the bitter cold that was the natural state of Norvengard. Beyond the window stretched his kingdom, a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible emptiness. The city of Crystal Haven spread below him, its buildings intact, its streets unmarked by the passage of time, but utterly devoid of life. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices carried on the wind. The marketplace where thousands had once bartered and laughed now stood silent, stalls still arranged as they had been on that day. 3 centuries passed when everything had changed. The Ice King pressed one pale hand against the window, and frost bloomed from his fingertips in intricate patterns that resembled nothing so much as memories given form. He could see them there in the frost. His wife, Alara, her dark hair a stark contrast to the whiteness of their world, her laughter bright enough to warm even the coldest winter day. Their daughter Freya, barely 10 winters old when the curse had fallen, her small hands always cold despite the furs they wrapped her in, her smile capable of melting his heart in ways the endless winter never could. His advisors, his guards, his subjects, all of them preserved in these frost memories, forever young, forever lost. The curse had come without warning, as such things often do. Iskeron had been a just ruler, perhaps too just for the liking of some. He had refused the demands of the witch lords of the eastern wastes, a cabal of sorcerers who had sought to use Norvengard as a staging ground for their conquest of the southern kingdoms. When they came with their armies of ice wraiths and frost giants, Iskeron had stood against them with his own magic, for the rulers of Norvengard had always possessed a connection to the winter, an ability to call upon the cold itself as both weapon and shield. The battle had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, the sky itself torn apart by competing magics. Iskeron had proven stronger than the witch lords anticipated. One by one, he had shattered their armies, breaking the ice wraiths back into the formless cold from which they came, sending the frost giants fleeing back to their mountain caves. On the 7th day, as victory seemed certain, the witch lords had played their final desperate card. They had combined their remaining power into a single curse, not of destruction, but of isolation, not meant to kill, but to remove Norvengard from the world entirely. The curse had struck like a wave of invisible force, washing over the kingdom in an instant. Iskeron had felt it the moment it took hold, a sensation like being encased in amber, like being caught between one heartbeat and the next. Every living thing in Norvengard had been frozen, not in ice, but in time itself. His people had simply stopped, caught mid-step, mid-word, mid-breath. Children remained suspended in the act of throwing snowballs. Merchants held coins that would never complete their journey from hand to hand. His wife and daughter, who had been standing beside him on the palace balcony, became as still as statues carved from flesh. But Iskeron himself had been spared this fate, and that had been the cruelest part of the curse. As the ruler, as the one who wielded the magic of winter, he remained conscious, aware, alive in a way his subjects were not. He could move, could think, could feel, and feeling was the torture of it. The witch lords had ensured he would remain awake to witness his failure, to spend eternity among his frozen people, unable to break the curse, unable to save them, unable even to join them in their timeless sleep. The 1st century had been the hardest. Iskeron had tried everything within his considerable power to break the curse. He had pored over every scroll in the royal library, had attempted counterspells and rituals that drained him to the point of collapse. He had climbed to the highest peak of the Frostspire Mountains and called out to the ancient spirits of winter, begging for their aid. He had descended into the deepest ice caves where the old magic was said to dwell, offering himself as a sacrifice if only his people could be freed. Nothing had worked. The curse was too powerful, too perfectly crafted. It was woven from the combined might of 7 witch lords, and it would require something equally powerful to undo it. The 2nd century had brought resignation. Iskeron had continued his studies, but with less urgency, knowing in his heart that he had exhausted every possibility. He had walked among his frozen subjects, speaking to them as if they could hear, telling them stories of what the world beyond their kingdom must be like now. He had maintained the city as best he could, using his magic to repair structures damaged by the occasional earthquake or storm. he had kept Crystal Haven pristine, a perfect snapshot of a moment 300 years past, because to let it decay would have been to admit defeat, to acknowledge that his people were truly lost. The 3rd century, the one in which he now found himself in its twilight years, had brought something unexpected. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of renewed purpose. Iskeran had begun to notice changes in the world beyond his kingdom. The aurora lights that danced above Norvengard had started to pulse with patterns he had never seen before. The winds that swept across the tundra carried whispers of words and languages that had not existed when his kingdom fell. Most significantly, he had felt tremors in the fabric of the curse itself, tiny fluctuations that suggested something in the wider world was changing, shifting in ways that might finally affect the magic that held Norvengard in its grip. It was this realization that had drawn him from his throne today. For the first time in 300 years, Iskeran felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of change. He turned from the window and made his way through the silent palace, his footsteps echoing in halls that had known no other sound for centuries. He passed through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, rulers of Norvengard stretching back 1,000 years, each one wearing the same crown of ice and silver that now rested on Iskeran's head. He wondered what they would think of him, whether they would see his survival as strength or his inability to break the curse as weakness. The palace library was his destination, a vast circular room with shelves that spiraled up toward a domed ceiling, painted with a map of the stars as they had appeared on the night of Norvengard's finding. Iskeran had spent countless hours here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of his people, books on magic and history, scrolls detailing ancient rituals, tablets carved with the words of the first winter mages. All of it had been consumed and studied and memorized until he could recite entire volumes from memory. But today he sought something specific. Deep in the library's heart, protected by wards only he could pass, stood a single pedestal made from black ice quarried from the deepest part of the northern ocean. Upon this pedestal rested a book bound in white leather, its pages made from something that was neither paper nor parchment, but rather seemed to be frozen light given solid form. This was the Codex of Endless Winter, the most sacred text of Norvengard, written by the kingdom's founder, Bormak I, more than a millennium ago. Iskeran had consulted the Codex countless times over the centuries, but always he had focused on the sections dealing with magic, with spells and counter curses. Now, prompted by some instinct he could not name, he opened the book to its final pages, sections he had largely ignored because they dealt not with magic but with prophecy. Bormak had possessed the gift of foresight, and in his final years he had recorded visions of Norvengard's future, cryptic passages that spoke of trials and triumphs yet to come. The Ice King's fingers traced over words written in silver ink that shimmered even in the dim light of the library. Most of the prophecies he had read before and dismissed as either fulfilled or irrelevant, but one passage now caught his attention, a verse he had somehow overlooked in all his previous readings, or perhaps one that had not been visible until this moment. The ink seemed to glow brighter as his gaze fell upon it, and he read aloud, his voice the only sound in the silent library. When 3 centuries have turned and the world beyond remembers not the crown of ice, and the guardian stands alone among his frozen children, and despair has worn the edges of his hope to nothing, then shall come the thaw. not from within, but from without. Not through power, but through sacrifice. Not by magic, but by the one thing magic cannot touch. A heart unchanged by time. A love that refuses to forget. Iskeron read the passage 3 times, each word settling into his mind like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through his understanding. 3 centuries, the exact time that had passed, the world that had forgotten him. That much was certainly true. But the rest, this talk of thaw and sacrifice and unchanged hearts, what could it mean? He had sacrificed everything already. His kingdom, his family, his own existence beyond these frozen borders. What more could possibly be required? He closed the codex and stood in the silent library, feeling the weight of the prophecy settle over him, like a new burden added to the many he already carried. For 300 years, he had been reactive, trying to break a curse that had already been cast, attempting to undo what had been done. But prophecy suggested a different approach, not breaking the curse, but waiting for conditions to align, for the right moment when the magic might finally be vulnerable. The tremors he had felt in the curse, the changes in the aurora, the whispers on the wind. Perhaps these were signs that the moment was approaching. Perhaps after 3 centuries of isolation, the world was finally ready to remember the Ice King of the North. But how would this remembering come? Who in the world beyond Norvengard even knew his kingdom had existed? The curse had not merely frozen his people in time, it had erased Norvengard from the memory of the world, removed it from maps and histories, caused those who had once known of the Northern Kingdom to forget it had ever been. Iskeron left the library and made his way to the highest tower of the palace, a journey that took him up a spiral staircase of 563 steps. He had counted them many times during his long isolation. At the top was an observatory, a room with walls of pure ice that allowed an unobstructed view of the lands in all directions. Here, he kept instruments that measured the flow of magic in the world, delicate constructs of crystal and silver that had been created by the greatest artificers of old Norvengard. The instruments were all active, their needles and dials moving in ways they had not moved for decades. The ley lines, the invisible rivers of magical energy that flowed through the world, were shifting. Something significant was happening beyond the borders of his frozen kingdom. Something that was affecting the very fabric of magic itself. Iskeron studied the readings, his mind working through possibilities. A great working of magic somewhere in the world? A natural phenomenon that affected the flow of energy? Or perhaps something related to the curse itself? Some external change that was weakening the bonds that held Norvengard outside of time? As he pondered these questions, movement in the distance caught his eye. Iskeron froze, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. There, at the very edge of his kingdom, where the frozen tundra met the slightly less frozen tundra that marked the border of Norvengard's curse, something was moving. For the first time in 300 years, something living had approached his kingdom. The Ice King pressed his face close to the wall, his breath forming patterns of frost on the already frozen surface. The figure was small, human-sized, wrapped in furs that marked them as a traveler from the south. He moved slowly, struggling against the wind and snow that was ever present at Norvengard's borders. As Iskeron watched, the figure stumbled, fell, rose again with evident difficulty. They were alone, which was strange. No one traveled the northern wastes alone, not if they valued their life. Yet here was someone doing exactly that, making their way directly toward the one place in the north that no one should have been able to find, that no one should have even remembered existed. A spark of something Iskaran had not felt in centuries flared in his chest. Excitement, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. He left the observatory at a run, descending the stairs 3 at a time, racing through the palace halls with a speed that belied his ancient nature. He had to reach the border, had to see who this impossible traveler was, had to understand why they had come. The prophecy's words echoed in his mind, not from within, but from without. The journey from the palace to the kingdom's border took Iskaran just under an hour, even moving at his fastest pace. He could have used his magic to transport himself instantly, but something made him want to make the journey on foot, to feel the reality of movement after so long sitting still. He passed through Crystal Haven, through streets where his frozen subjects stood eternal guard over shops and homes. He passed through the great gates of the city, massive constructs of iron and ice that had not been opened since the day the curse fell. He passed through the outlying villages, through farmlands where crops stood frozen in their fields, forever on the verge of harvest. Finally, he reached the border, marked by a line of standing stones that the first rulers of Norvengard had erected to define their territory. Beyond these stones, the world was muted, colors less vibrant, sounds less clear. This was the edge of the curse, the boundary between frozen time and the world that continued to turn. Iskaran could cross this boundary if he wished, could walk out into the wider world, but he never had. To leave Norvengard would have been to abandon his people. That was something he could never do. The traveller had collapsed just beyond the standing stones, their body a small, dark shape against the white snow. Iskaran could see their chest rising and falling. They were alive, but barely. Without thinking about the consequences, acting on an instinct that came from being a ruler who had once cared deeply for the welfare of others, Iskaran stepped across the boundary. The moment his foot touched the ground beyond the standing stones, he felt it, a rush of sensation, of time flowing around him instead of standing still. It was disorienting after centuries of timelessness, like stepping from a quiet room into a roaring river. He reached the traveller in moments and knelt beside them, carefully turning them over. The furs fell away from their face, and Iskaran found himself looking at a young woman, perhaps 25 winters old, with dark hair that reminded him painfully of Alara. Her lips were blue with cold, her skin pale from exposure, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a warm brown that seemed to hold depths of determination. "The Ice King," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I found you. I remembered." Those words, "I remembered," struck Iskaran with the force of a physical blow. The curse made people forget. That was part of its power, part of what made it unbreakable. Yet here was someone who had remembered, who had somehow retained knowledge of Norvengard and its ruler, who had travelled across the frozen north alone to find a kingdom that should not have existed in anyone's memory. "Who are you?" Iskaran asked, his own voice rough from centuries of speaking only to himself. "How do you know of me?" The woman's eyes closed again, and for a moment Iskaran feared she had slipped into unconsciousness, or worse. But then she spoke, each word an effort. "My name is Astrid. My grandmother. She was from Norvengard. She escaped the day before the curse fell, she carried the memory, passed it down, told me to find you, told me you were waiting. Astrid's words rearranged Iskeran's understanding of everything. Someone had escaped the curse. It carried the memory of Norvengard out into the world. It kept that memory alive through generations until it reached this woman who had undertaken an impossible journey to find him. The prophecy's words came back to him, a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. He gathered Astrid into his arms, marveling at how light she was, how fragile compared to his own timeless existence. He carried her back across the boundary into Norvengard, and as he did, he felt something shift in the air around them. The curse, which had held absolute for 3 centuries, trembled. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Iskeran had spent so long studying the curse that he could feel every nuance of its structure. Bringing Astrid into Norvengard, bringing someone who remembered from the outside world, had created a crack in the magic, tiny but real. He took her to the palace, to his own chambers, where a fire burned that gave off no heat, but also required no fuel, one of the many paradoxes of his frozen kingdom. He laid her on his bed, the first person besides himself to occupy it in 300 years, and used his magic to slowly warm her, careful not to do it too quickly, lest the shock harm her. As colour returned to her face and her breathing steadied, Iskeran sat beside the bed and waited. It took several hours before Astrid fully woke. When she did, her eyes went wide as she took in her surroundings. The room of ice and silver, the magical fire, and most of all, Iskeran himself, the legendary Ice King made real. She sat up slowly, and Iskeran noticed she was stronger than he had expected, recovering with a resilience that spoke of determination and preparation. "I'm really here," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Norvengard. It's exactly as my grandmother described it. The Jewel of the North, she called it. She said it was the most beautiful place in the world." "Your grandmother," Iskeran said gently. "What was her name?" "Senna," Astrid replied. "She was a weaver in Crystalhaven. She had gone to visit her sister in the Southern Territories, and was delayed by a storm. When she returned, she found nothing. At first, she thought she had lost her way, that she had somehow ended up in the wrong place, but she knew these lands too well for that. Norvengard had simply vanished." Iskeran remembered Senna, though the memory was distant. She had been young when he had last seen her. Just a girl, really, learning her craft from her mother. That she had escaped the curse by pure chance seemed almost too perfect, as if fate itself had been laying groundwork for this moment 3 centuries in advance. "She tried to tell people," Astrid continued. "She went to the southern kingdoms, to the historians and the map makers, and told them about Norvengard, but no one believed her. They said there was no kingdom in the north, that she must have dreamed it or invented it. The curse had done its work well, but Senna refused to forget. She married, had children, and she told them all about the homeland she had lost. Most of them thought she was mad, or that she was telling stories. But my mother believed her, and she told me, and I believed too." "Why did you come?" Iskeran asked. "What made you attempt such a dangerous journey?" Astrid's expression grew serious. "Because my grandmother's final words before she died were about Norvengard. She made me promise that I would find it, that I would find you. She said the curse could only be broken by someone from outside who remembered, and that 3 centuries would pass before the time was right. She said... Astrid paused, as if unsure whether to continue. "Say it," Iskarin urged. "She said that you had been waiting alone all this time, that you had never stopped trying to save your people, and that you deserved to know someone still remembered, even if nothing could be done." The Ice King felt something crack inside himself, a different kind of breaking than the magical tremor in the curse. This was an emotional rupture, the wall he had built around his heart over centuries of isolation suddenly crumbling. Tears formed in his eyes, the first he had shed in 200 years, and they froze on his cheeks as they fell, tiny diamonds of ice that caught the light and sparkled. "I have waited," he said softly, "and I have tried everything, but I could never find the key to breaking the curse." Astrid reached out and took his hand, and Iskarin was shocked by the warmth of her touch, by the reminder of what living flesh felt like. "Show me your kingdom," she said. "Show me the people my grandmother loved, even if we cannot save them. Let me see what she remembered so clearly." And so Iskarin led Astrid through Norvengard, showing her crystal heaven in all its frozen glory, introducing her to his subjects who stood like statues throughout the city. He showed her the marketplace where her grandmother would have worked, the weaver's district with its looms still threaded with half-finished tapestries. He showed her the palace gardens where ice flowers bloomed eternal, never wilting, never growing, caught forever in their peak beauty. He showed her his family, Ilara and Freya, still standing on the balcony where they had been when the curse fell, and Astrid wept for them, tears that marked the first real grieving Iskarin had witnessed for his lost kingdom in all the long centuries. As they walked and talked, Iskarin felt the curse continue to tremble. Each hour Astrid spent in Norvengard, each memory she shared of what her grandmother had told her, each moment she existed as a living link between the frozen kingdom and the world that had forgotten it, weakened the magic that held them. By the time they returned to the palace, Iskarin could feel it clearly. The curse was failing. "It's you," he said to Astrid as they stood in the throne room. "You are the key. The prophecy spoke of a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. Your grandmother loved Norvengard so much that she kept its memory alive for 3 centuries, passing that love down through her family until it reached you. That's what the curse cannot withstand. Not power, not magic, but memory preserved through generations. Love that refuses to die." Astrid looked around the throne room with new understanding. "Then what do we do? How do we finish breaking the curse?" Iskarin walked to his throne and removed the crown from his head, the crown of ice and silver that had marked him as king for 3 centuries. He held it out to Astrid. The curse was designed to isolate Norvengard, to make the world forget. But you remembered. You came. You brought the outside world back to us. Now, we need to do the same in reverse. We need to bring Norvengard back to the world. He placed the crown in her hands. "Take this beyond the border. Return to your home, to your people. Show them this crown. Tell them the story of Norvengard. Make them remember. When enough people in the outside world hold the memory of this kingdom in their hearts, when we exist in the collective consciousness of the world again, the curse will have no power. We will snap back into time, back into the world, as if we had never left." Astrid held the crown, feeling its weight, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. But that could take years, decades. How will you survive that much longer alone? I have already survived 3 centuries, Iskaran said with a sad smile. I can endure whatever time is necessary. Besides, I won't be truly alone anymore. Now I know someone remembers, someone cares. That changes everything. But Astrid shook her head. There has to be another way. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice. What if... She paused, thinking. What if the sacrifice is mine to make, not yours? You've already sacrificed everything. Maybe it's time someone sacrificed something for you. Before Iskaran could ask what she meant, Astrid closed her eyes and clasped the crown tightly. She began to speak in a language Iskaran didn't recognize at first, but then he realized it was Old Norvengardian, the ancient dialect that predated even Vormak I. His eyes widened as he understood. Senna had taught her family not just memories of Norvengard, but its language, its magic, its very essence. Astrid was working a spell, one that Iskaran quickly recognized as incredibly dangerous. She was offering herself as a bridge, using her life force to connect Norvengard to the outside world, to pull the kingdom back into the flow of time, by anchoring it to her own timeline. It was brilliant and terrible. It would work, but the strain might kill her. "Stop," Iskaran commanded, rushing forward. "You'll die." "I'm willing to risk it," Astrid said. Her voice strained as power built around her. My grandmother spent her whole life mourning what she had lost. She passed that grief down to my mother, to me. Let me turn that grief into something good. Let me be the one who brings Norvengard home. The magic swirled around them both now, visible as streams of light that flowed between Astrid and the very walls of the throne room. Iskaran could feel the curse shattering, breaking apart under the assault of this impossible spell, but he could also feel Astrid weakening, her life force being consumed by the working. Without thinking, acting on instinct and 3 centuries of mastered magic, Iskaran joined his power to hers. The Ice King reached out and took Astrid's hands, the crown held between their joined palms. He poured his own magic into the spell, adding his strength to hers, sharing the burden she had tried to take on alone. Together, their combined power surged through Norvengard, touching every frozen citizen, every stopped moment, every suspended second of the last 300 years. The curse broke with a sound like the world's largest mirror shattering. Time rushed back into Norvengard like a flood, and suddenly everything was moving again. In the marketplace, merchants completed sales that had been frozen mid-transaction. In homes throughout Crystal Haven, families finished conversations that had been interrupted 3 centuries ago. On the palace balcony, Alara and Freya gasped as time resumed, finding themselves looking at a city unchanged yet somehow different. And in the throne room, Iskaran and Astrid collapsed together, the spell complete, the curse broken, the cost paid. The Ice King looked up at the ceiling of his throne room and saw, for the first time in 300 years, dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles that moved and drifted, because time was flowing again, because change was possible again, because his kingdom had returned to the world. Beside him, Astrid breathed heavily but smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "Your people are free." Iskaran took her hand and helped her to her feet. Outside, he could hear sounds he had not heard in centuries. Voices raised in confusion and wonder. Footsteps as people moved through the streets. The living sounds of the kingdom restored. He looked at Astrid, this impossible woman who had traveled across the world to remember what everyone else had forgotten, and he knew that whatever came next, Norvingard would face it, not alone, but as part of the world again, connected, remembered, and finally free. The forgotten Ice King of the North was forgotten no more, the Knights Templar's hidden treasure. The autumn rain hammered against the limestone walls of the Templar commandery in Poitou, France, as Brother Guillaume pressed his weathered hands against the cold stone table. Before him lay a rolled parchment sealed with wax, bearing the unmistakable cross pâté of the order. The year was 1307, and whispers of King Philip's intentions had reached even this remote outpost. "They will come for us," said Brother Arnaud, his younger companion, voice trembling slightly. "The king's men are already moving through Paris. They arrested Grand Master de Molay at dawn 3 days ago." Guillaume nodded slowly, his grey beard catching the firelight from the hearth. He had served the order for 43 years, since he was barely 14, and had witnessed the fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. He had carried secrets across the Mediterranean, guarded treasures in the vaults beneath the Paris temple, and now, in the twilight of his service, he faced the greatest task of all. "Then we have less time than I hoped," Guillaume said, breaking the seal on the parchment. His eyes scanned the Latin script, written in the distinctive hand of the Order's treasurer. "The instructions are clear. We are to move the contents of the vault to the designated location. The maps have been divided among 7 commanderies, and we hold the 3rd key." The treasure of the Knights Templar was not simply gold and silver, though there was plenty of that. Over 2 centuries, the warrior monks had accumulated wealth that rivaled kingdoms. They had established the first international banking system, holding deposits for nobles, merchants, and even rival monarchs. Their fleet controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. But the true treasure, the one that made kings tremble and popes uneasy, was knowledge, documents, relics, and secrets gathered from the ancient world. Guillaume rose from the table and moved to the eastern wall of the chamber. He counted 7 stones from the corner and pressed against a particular block. With a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Arnaud lit a torch, and together they descended into the depths beneath the commandery. The vault was not large, but what it contained was priceless. Wooden chests bound with iron bands lined the walls. Guillaume knew their contents intimately. Each had been catalogued and committed to memory. There were Byzantine manuscripts rescued from Constantinople, scrolls recovered from the libraries of Alexandria through intermediaries in Cairo, astronomical charts from Muslim scholars, and documents that challenged the very foundations of the Church's teachings. In the center of the vault stood a stone altar, and upon it rested an object wrapped in crimson silk. Guillaume approached it reverently, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of what he touched. He unwrapped the silk carefully, revealing a copper scroll covered in ancient Hebrew script. "Is that—" Arnaud began, his voice barely a whisper. "The copper scroll from Qumran," Guillaume confirmed, "one of the Dead Sea texts. describes the locations of treasures hidden before the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The order acquired it 30 years ago through contacts in the East. Some say it is merely symbolic, but I have studied it. The measurements are too precise, the locations too specific. It is genuine. But there was more. Behind the altar, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that Guillaume had been sworn to protect above all else. He carefully removed the covering, revealing a wooden box of acacia wood, its surface covered with gold leaf and intricate carvings. The craftsmanship was unmistakably ancient, predating even Rome itself. "What is it?" Arnaud asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Guillaume hesitated. The younger knight had taken his vows, had proven himself in battle, but some secrets were almost too dangerous to share. Yet, if Guillaume fell, if King Philip's men captured or killed him, someone else needed to know. "There are legends," Guillaume began, "of what the first Templars found beneath Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Most believe we discovered gold, perhaps the treasures of Herod, but the 9 knights who established our order spent 9 years excavating beneath the Temple Mount. What would take 9 years to find?" He opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled in aged linen, were fragments of stone tablets, the Hebrew letters still visible despite their great age. Beside them lay several papyrus scrolls, their edges crumbling, but their contents preserved by the dry climate of their original resting place. "These tablets," Guillaume said, his voice heavy with significance, "are said to be fragments of the original stones carried down from Mount Sinai. The scrolls contain teachings that were never included in the approved scripture, texts that show a very different understanding of the divine than what Rome permits." Arnaud's face paled. "If the church knew—" "They do know, or at least suspect," Guillaume replied. "Why else would King Philip move against us so suddenly? The order has become too powerful, too independent. We answer to no king, only to the Pope, and even Rome fears what we might reveal. Philip needs our wealth to pay his debts, but he also needs to ensure these secrets never surface." For 3 nights, the 2 knights worked tirelessly. They removed the contents of the vault, carefully packing everything into leather satchels and wooden crates designed to be carried by horse. The gold and silver were separated. Some would be buried in locations marked on the fractured map, insurance for the order's future. But the documents, the scrolls, the tablets, these would be moved together to a single location where they could be protected. On the 4th morning, a messenger arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Guillaume recognized him as Brother Michel from the Tours Commandery. "They are coming," Michel gasped, accepting a cup of water. "The king's seneschal rides with 300 men. They have orders to arrest every Templar in France and seize all property. I rode through the night to warn you." Guillaume glanced at Arnaud. "How much time?" "A day, perhaps less. They were making camp at Loudun when I passed them." It would have to be enough. Guillaume had already arranged for a ship, a Templar vessel that had been loading cargo in La Rochelle for the past week, ostensibly bound for Scotland with wool and wine. The captain was a man Guillaume trusted, someone who owed the order his life and would ask no questions. They loaded the horses under cover of darkness. 12 animals in total, 8 carrying the treasure, 4 for the riders. Guillaume, Arnaud, Michel, and a 4th knight, Brother Thomas, who served as the commandery's military commander. Each man wore plain clothing, their Templar mantles hidden in their saddlebags. They could not risk being identified on the road. The journey to La Rochelle normally took 3 days, but Guillaume pushed them hard, staying off the main roads, cutting through forests and following old Roman paths that few remembered. They paused only briefly to rest the horses and snatch a few hours of sleep in abandoned shepherds' huts or beneath the shelter of ancient oaks. On the second day, as they forded a stream in the Vendée, Arnaud spotted riders in the distance. 5 men, wearing the king's colours, moving parallel to their position. Guillaume made a quick decision. They couldn't risk a confrontation. Even if they prevailed, the alarm would be raised. "There's a forest ahead," Thomas said, studying the landscape. "Thick growth, difficult for horses. We could lose them there." They urged their mounts forward, the pack animals protesting the increased pace. Behind them, the royal men-at-arms had spotted them and gave chase. Guillaume felt his heart pounding, not from fear for himself, but from the terror that 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge might fall into the wrong hands. The forest was dense with oak and beech, the undergrowth thick with brambles. They plunged into it, the branches clawing at their clothing. Behind them came shouts, the sound of horses crashing through brush. Guillaume led them deeper, following a path that Thomas had used years before when hunting in these woods. They emerged into a clearing, and for a moment, Guillaume thought they were trapped, but Thomas pointed to a narrow ravine, barely visible behind a screen of ferns. "This way." The ravine was steep, the descent treacherous, but the pack horses were mountain-bred and sure-footed. They picked their way down carefully, while behind them the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The king's men, unfamiliar with the terrain, had lost them in the dense forest. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of La Rochelle. The port city was bustling even at this late hour, ships being loaded by torchlight, merchants arguing over cargo manifests, sailors singing in taverns near the docks. Guillaume led them to a warehouse near the harbour, identified by a small carved cross above the door, a Templar safe house. The warehouse keeper, an old sailor named Pierre, who had lost his leg in service to the order, opened the door quickly and ushered them inside. "The ship awaits, Brother Guillaume. Captain Jean has been asking for you. The tide turns at dawn, and he wishes to depart immediately." They worked through the night, transferring the cargo from horses to ship. The vessel was a sturdy cog, broad-beamed and built for Atlantic waters, with a single mast and a crew of 20. Captain Jean was a Breton, his face weathered by years at sea, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Scotland?" Guillaume asked, as the last of the crates were loaded into the hold. "Eventually," Jean replied, "but we'll stop first at several ports along the way. If we're being followed, I want to lay false trails. We'll put in at Bordeaux, claim we're heading to England, then we'll sail north to Brittany, spread word that we're trading with Ireland. By the time anyone figures out our true destination, we'll be long gone." Guillaume approved. The captain was thinking ahead, protecting not just this voyage, but future operations. The order had been betrayed, but it was not destroyed, not yet. As dawn broke over La Rochelle, the ship slipped its moorings and moved out into the harbour. Guillaume stood at the rail, watching the city recede into the morning mist. Somewhere behind them, King Philip's men were ransacking Templar properties, arresting knights, seizing assets. But the true treasure of the order was safely aboard this vessel, sailing toward a new home. The voyage was not easy. They encountered storms off the Breton coast that tested even Captain Jean's considerable skill. The Atlantic in October was unforgiving, with waves that towered over the ship's rail and winds that threatened to tear the sail from its rigging. Guillaume spent much of the journey below decks, securing the cargo, ensuring that nothing was damaged by the constant pitching and rolling. Brother Arnaud proved to have a weak stomach for sea travel and spent 3 days barely able to lift his head. Michel fared better, helping the crew with their work, his muscular frame useful in managing the heavy canvas and thick ropes. Thomas stood watch, his soldier's instincts keeping him alert for any sign of pursuit, though on the empty ocean there was little threat beyond the elements themselves. After 10 days at sea, they reached the Scottish coast. Captain Jean guided the ship through treacherous waters, past rocky outcrops and hidden reefs, following a passage that only local pilots knew. They anchored in a secluded bay on the western coast, where steep cliffs provided natural protection and dense forests came almost to the water's edge. Guillaume had chosen this location carefully, years before, when it became clear that the Order's position in France was becoming precarious. Scotland was beyond the reach of Philip's power, and King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope and locked in a struggle for his throne, had no love for the church hierarchy that condemned him. He would welcome Templar gold and Templar knights, and in return he would offer protection. But Guillaume's destination was not a castle or a city. Deep in the Scottish Highlands, in a valley accessible only by a single narrow pass, stood the ruins of an ancient monastery. It had been built centuries ago by Irish monks, long before the Norse raids, and had been abandoned for 200 years. The locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted, which suited Guillaume's purposes perfectly. They transferred the cargo to pack horses again, animals purchased from a local laird who asked no questions when presented with good silver. The journey inland took another week, following paths that were barely more than game trails, climbing into mountains where mist clung to the peaks, and rain fell almost constantly. The valley, when they finally reached it, was exactly as Guillaume remembered from his single previous visit, 20 years earlier. A narrow gorge opened into a sheltered basin, surrounded on all sides by steep slopes. A stream ran through the center, feeding a small lake. The ruins of the monastery stood on a slight rise above the water, its stone walls still largely intact despite centuries of neglect. "This is where we hide the treasure of the Order?" Arnaud asked, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice. He had perhaps expected something more dramatic, more befitting the legends. Guillaume smiled. "This is where we preserve it, yes, but not in the ruins themselves. Come." He led them past the crumbling monastery to the base of the cliff that formed the valley's northern wall. Water seeped from the rock face, creating a perpetually wet surface covered in moss and ferns. Guillaume pushed aside the vegetation, revealing the opening of a cave. "Natural?" Thomas asked, studying the entrance with a military eye. "In part," Guillaume replied, "but expanded long ago. The Irish monks used it as a crypt. There are chambers inside, carved from the living rock, dry, cool, perfect for preserving documents." They spent the next month preparing the cave system. Using tools they had brought with them, they carved deeper chambers, created ventilation shafts disguised as natural fissures, and built hidden doorways that could be sealed from within. The gold and silver were divided, some buried in scattered locations throughout the valley, others placed in chambers within the cave. sealed behind false walls that appeared to be solid rock. The documents, scrolls, and relics were given the greatest care. Guillaume constructed wooden shelves, treated with oils to resist moisture. Each scroll was wrapped individually in oiled leather, each document placed between boards of cedar wood. The stone tablets were set into recesses carved specifically for them, protected by multiple layers of sealing. As winter approached and the first snows began to fall in the highlands, Guillaume knew their work was nearly complete. He gathered the 3 knights in the main chamber of the cave, where a small fire provided light and warmth. What we have preserved here must remain hidden until the time is right for it to be revealed, he said, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. The order may be scattered, our brothers imprisoned or worse, but our legacy endures. The knowledge we have gathered, the truths we have discovered, they are more valuable than all the gold in Christendom. He produced a leather journal from his pack, its pages covered in his own careful handwriting. I have created this guide for those who come after us. It contains the key to understanding what we have hidden. Here, descriptions of the most important documents, and instructions for interpreting the copper scroll. But the journal itself is encrypted, using a cipher known only to senior members of the Order. And if the Order is destroyed, Mitchell asked quietly, if there is no one left who knows the cipher? Guillaume had considered this possibility. Then we must ensure the knowledge survives in other ways. Thomas, you will return to France carefully in disguise. Find any surviving brothers and pass word of this location. Use the old signs, the marks that only we understand. Arno, you will go to Portugal, where some of our number have found refuge under a different name. Tell them what we have accomplished here. Michel, you will remain in Scotland, establish yourself, perhaps marry, have children, pass down the knowledge in your family, coded in stories and songs, so that even if the Order fades from memory, there will be those who remember. And you, Brother Guillaume? Arnaud asked. I am old, Guillaume said simply. My task is complete. I will remain here, in this valley, as guardian. When spring comes, you will build me a small dwelling near the cave entrance. I will live out my remaining years, ensuring that what we have hidden remains secure. The 3 younger knights tried to protest, but Guillaume raised his hand. This is not punishment, but privilege. I have spent my life in service to the Order, and I can think of no better way to end it than as the keeper of our greatest treasure. Besides, someone must remain. If the entrance is left unguarded, if shepherds or hunters stumble upon it, everything we have risked will be for nothing. Through that first winter, Guillaume lived in a simple stone hut the knights constructed for him before departing on their separate missions. The structure was built against the base of the cliff, using stones from the ruined monastery, with a roof of slate and timber. A small hearth provided warmth, and the stream offered fresh water and fish. Guillaume had provisions enough to last until spring, when he could plant a small garden. The solitude did not trouble him. After decades of communal living in Templar commanderies, where silence was often enforced but privacy rare, he found the isolation almost restful. His days fell into a rhythm: morning prayers, maintenance of the cave and its contents, foraging for food, and in the evenings, by firelight, he worked on his journal, adding details, refining the cipher, ensuring that his knowledge would not die with him. Spring came late to the highlands, but when it arrived, the valley transformed. Wildflowers covered the meadows, birds returned to nest in the cliffs, and the stream swelled with snowmelt. Guillaume planted barley and turnips, tended a small flock of sheep he had traded for with the nearest settlement, and gradually transformed his temporary shelter into a permanent hermitage. Months passed into years. Guillaume aged, his beard turning completely white, his movements slower but still purposeful. He marked the passage of time by carving notches into a wooden staff, one for each month. He prayed for his brothers in the order, wondering how many had survived the king's persecution. He knew that Grand Master Jacques de Molay had been burned at the stake in Paris, and that hundreds of other Templars had been tortured, imprisoned, or killed. But he also knew that many had escaped, had found refuge in places beyond Philip's reach. In the 3rd year of his guardianship, a visitor arrived. Guillaume was working in his garden when he heard a horse approaching. His hand went instinctively to the sword he still kept close, though he was now 70 years old and doubted he could put up much of a fight. But when the rider emerged from the narrow pass, Guillaume recognized the travel-worn face of brother Michel. "You've returned," Guillaume said, embracing his former companion. "I bring news," Michel replied. "Much has happened in the world beyond this valley. The order has been officially dissolved by papal decree, our properties distributed to the Hospitallers, our name condemned. But there are survivors, scattered groups who maintain the traditions in secret. Some have joined other orders, some have simply disappeared into ordinary life, but they remember. They sat by Guillaume's fire that night, while Michel shared his news. He had indeed established himself in Scotland, married a local woman, and now had 2 young sons. He worked as a merchant, his Templar past carefully hidden, but he maintained contact with others who had escaped the purge. There was an underground network, he explained, of former Templars and their descendants, passing messages through coded letters and secret symbols. "There's more," Michel said, his voice dropping. "There's a legend spreading, particularly in France. People say that the Templar treasure was never found, that it was smuggled away before the arrests. Some claim it was taken to Scotland, others say Portugal or Cyprus. There are treasure hunters, adventurers, and agents of various kings searching for it." Guillaume nodded slowly. He had anticipated this. "Have any come close?" "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. That's why I've come. We need to add additional protections, create false trails, ensure that if someone does find this valley, they won't easily discover what lies beneath." Over the following weeks, they worked together to enhance the cave's concealment. They created a false chamber near the entrance, placing some items of moderate value, old coins, a few pieces of silver plate, some unremarkable documents, where they could be found. Any treasure hunter discovering this decoy would believe they had found the Templar cache and might not search further. The true treasure, deeper in the cave system, was hidden behind sealed passages that appeared to be natural walls. They also created markers, symbols that would mean nothing to outsiders, but would guide initiated members of the order to the valley. Guillaume knew that as time passed and he eventually died, there needed to be a way for others to find what had been hidden. So they carved subtle signs into rocks along the approach route. A cross here, a geometric pattern there, markers that would endure for centuries if properly maintained. Michel stayed for 3 months before departing again, promising to return when he could. Guillaume resumed his solitary existence, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just guarding the treasure, but maintaining a beacon for the future, a light that would guide those who came seeking truth. More years passed. Guillaume's body grew weaker, but his mind remained sharp. He transferred more of his knowledge into his journal, knowing that his time was limited. He wrote about the significance of each major document in the collection, explained the context of the relics, and provided his own translations and interpretations of the most important texts. One document in particular had occupied much of his later research, a gospel, not one of the four approved by the Church, but an account attributed to Mary Magdalene herself. The order had acquired it from a monastery in Ethiopia, where such alternative scriptures had been preserved by their isolated Christian community. Guillaume had spent years studying it, comparing it with other texts in the collection, and he was convinced of its authenticity. The Gospel presented a very different picture of Christ's mission, emphasizing spiritual knowledge over blind faith, suggesting that salvation came through understanding rather than through the institutional church. It was easy to see why such texts had been suppressed. They challenged the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. But Guillaume believed that truth, however uncomfortable, deserved to be preserved. In the year 1320, 13 years after he had first entered the valley, Guillaume knew his end was approaching. His heart troubled him, his breathing was laboured, and he could no longer work in the garden or tend the sheep. He spent his final days in the cave itself, among the treasures he had protected for so long. His journal opened before him as he added his final entries. He wrote instructions for whoever would find his body and his journal. He explained how to access the sealed chambers, how to interpret the cipher he had used, and most importantly, he wrote why these things mattered. Knowledge, he insisted, was humanity's greatest treasure, more valuable than gold because it could not be stolen, could not corrode, could only grow and compound over generations. On a cold morning in late autumn, Guillaume died peacefully in the cave, his hand resting on the wooden box containing the stone tablets, his journal beside him. His body was discovered weeks later by a shepherd who had ventured into the valley seeking lost sheep. The man, frightened by finding a corpse in what locals considered a haunted place, quickly retreated and told no one except the village priest. The priest, a former Templar sergeant named Edmund, who had escaped persecution by taking holy orders under a false name, recognized the description of the dead man and understood immediately what it meant. He traveled to the valley, found Guillaume's body, and gave him a proper burial in the small cemetery beside the ruined monastery. And then, understanding his duty, Edmund took Guillaume's journal and added his own name to the list of guardians. For the next 2 centuries, the valley remained protected by a succession of such guardians, each one a descendant or associate of the Templar network that had survived underground. They lived as hermits, shepherds, or monks, maintaining the valley's isolation while ensuring the cave and its contents remained undisturbed. The journal passed from hand to hand, each guardian adding their own entries, recording historical events, noting changes to the hiding places, and preserving the knowledge of the cipher. By the early 16th century, during the upheaval of the Reformation, the guardianship had passed to a family of Scottish Protestants who saw the preserved documents as ammunition against Catholic Rome. They understood that the alternative Gospels and ancient texts could support their arguments for a return to a purer, earlier Christianity. But they also recognized the danger. Revealing the treasure too soon, before the time was right, might lead to its destruction rather than its vindication. The guardian in 1547 was a woman named Isabel MacLeod, granddaughter of the previous keeper, who had learned the secrets of the valley from her father after her older brothers died in clan warfare. She was unusual for her time, literate, educated in Latin and Greek, and fiercely protective of her charge. She copied portions of the hidden documents, making translations that she could share with trusted scholars without revealing the existence of the original texts. One of these scholars was a young mathematician and astronomer named John Napier, who would later become famous for inventing logarithms. Isabel showed him astronomical texts from the Templar collection, calculations made by Persian and Arab scholars that were far in advance of European knowledge. These texts influenced Napier's own work, though he never knew their true source. Isabel made another crucial contribution to the treasure's preservation. She created a comprehensive map of the valley and cave system, showing not just the location of the hidden chambers, but also the meanings of the various symbols and markers. She appended this map to Guillaume's journal, which had grown considerably over the centuries, and she instituted a practice that would continue for generations. Each guardian would create a copy of the most essential information and hide it in a separate location, insurance against the loss of the main journal. The 17th century brought new dangers. The English Civil War spilled into Scotland, armies marched across the Highlands, and refugees fled into remote areas seeking safety. Twice the valley was nearly discovered by soldiers, and once by a group of Covenanters fleeing persecution. Each time, the Guardian managed to convince the intruders that the valley was cursed or haunted, encouraging them to move on quickly. By 1700, the direct line of Templar descendants had thinned considerably. Many had died without heirs, others had emigrated to the New World, and some had simply lost interest in maintaining the ancient trust. The guardianship passed to a Catholic family, the Frasers, who had their own reasons for protecting secrets from Protestant authorities. They understood that the documents in the cave could be dangerous to both Catholic and Protestant establishments, proving that both sides had distorted early Christian teachings to suit their own purposes. Throughout the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought new interest in ancient texts and historical mysteries. Scholars began to seriously study comparative religion, to question traditional narratives, and to seek out alternative sources. The guardians of the valley began to wonder if perhaps the time had finally come to reveal at least some of what had been hidden. In 1776, a young scholar named William Fraser, current guardian, made contact with Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria. Weishaupt had founded an organization dedicated to preserving and propagating Enlightenment ideals against religious obscurantism. William provided him with copies of some of the philosophical texts from the collection, though not the most sensitive materials. This connection would later give rise to conspiracy theories linking the Templars, the Illuminati, and various other secret societies, most of which were based on misunderstandings and exaggerations. The French Revolution nearly proved disastrous for the treasure. Revolutionary fervour against the church and aristocracy included hatred of the Templars, who were seen as symbols of medieval corruption. Treasure hunters, newly emboldened, began searching more aggressively for Templar caches throughout Europe. Several expeditions came to Scotland following rumours and legends, though none found the hidden valley. As the 19th century progressed, the guardianship faced a new challenge: modernization. Railways were being built across Scotland, remote areas were being mapped and surveyed, and the valley's isolation could not be guaranteed forever. In 1842, the Guardian, a schoolteacher named Robert Cameron, made a momentous decision. He began to slowly, carefully, move some of the most important documents to other locations. This was controversial even among the small network of people who knew about the treasure. Some argued that dispersing the collection increased the risk of discovery or loss, but Robert argued persuasively that having everything in one location was itself a risk. Fire, flood, landslide, or discovery could destroy it all in one stroke. Better to distribute the materials, creating redundancy and increasing the chances that something would survive to the modern era. Over 20 years, Robert systematically moved documents. Some went to private collections, their true significance hidden among other manuscripts. Some were donated anonymously to university libraries, where they were catalogued as minor curiosities of uncertain provenance. The most sensitive materials, the stone tablets, the copper scroll, the alternative gospels, remained in the cave, but now they had companions scattered across Scotland, England, and even France. Robert also did something else revolutionary. He photographed the documents. Photography was still a new technology, but Robert recognized its potential. He created a photographic record of the collection, multiple copies hidden in bank vaults and with trusted associates. Now, even if the originals were lost, their contents would survive. The 20th century brought unprecedented changes. 2 world wars sent armies across Europe again. Governments became more intrusive and capable of surveillance, and nowhere remained truly remote. In 1942, fearing Nazi interest in occult artifacts and esoteric knowledge, the Guardian at that time moved the remaining items from the cave to a new location, a specially constructed vault beneath Manor House in the lowlands. This final move marked the end of the valley's role in the story. The cave was empty now, its secrets dispersed, its guardianship passed into history. But the tradition continued. There were still people who knew about the Templar treasure, who protected the journal and its copies, who ensured that the dispersed documents remained safe. In the late 20th century, scholars began publishing research on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, and other ancient texts that challenged traditional religious narratives. Some of these scholars, unknowingly, were working with documents that had come from the Templar collection, materials that had been hidden for 7 centuries before gradually making their way into academic circulation. The story might have ended there, another medieval mystery partially solved by modern scholarship. But in 2003, a historian named Dr. Sarah Chen made an unexpected discovery. While researching Templar history in Scotland, she found a reference in an old parish record to a hermit in the Highlands who had been buried with great ceremony in 1320. The description of the location matched no known monastic site, and the elaborate burial seemed odd for a simple hermit. Following this lead, Dr. Chen spent months searching, using modern mapping technology, satellite imagery, and hiking through remote valleys. She found the ruins of the old monastery, the remnants of stone huts, and finally, the cave. It was empty, of course, but on the walls, barely visible beneath centuries of grime and mineral deposits, she found carved symbols, crosses, geometric patterns, and marks that matched Templar iconography. She also found something else, a sealed ceramic jar hidden in a crack in the cave ceiling, placed so cleverly that it had been missed by all previous occupants. Inside was a letter written in Latin, dated 1862. It was from Robert Cameron, the guardian who had dispersed the collection. He had left this message for whoever finally discovered the cave, explaining in general terms what had been hidden there and why. If you read this, the letter said, it means the valley's secret has finally been revealed. Do not despair that you have not found gold or jewels. The true treasure of the Templars was never material wealth, but knowledge. Knowledge that challenges, enlightens, and transforms. Much of what we protected has now, through various means, found its way into the world. It lives in libraries, in universities, in the minds of scholars who study texts they do not realize were preserved by warrior monks 7 centuries ago. The guardianship has ended because it succeeded. The light that the Templars kindled has not been extinguished, but has spread beyond any cave or vault to illuminate the world. Dr. Chen published her findings in a carefully worded academic paper. She described finding the cave and the letter, discussed the historical evidence for a Templar presence in Scotland, and suggested that some materials from Templar archives might have survived and been integrated into later collections. She did not reveal everything the letter contained. Some secrets were still too sensitive, some connections too dangerous to make explicit. But she understood now the larger truth. The Knights Templar's hidden treasure had never been lost. It had been carefully, methodically, brilliantly preserved and dispersed over 7 centuries by a succession of dedicated guardians. Pieces of it lived in museums, libraries, private collections, and scholarly publications around the world. The knowledge that Guillaume and his companions had risked everything to protect had achieved exactly what they hoped. It had survived, it had spread, and it continued to challenge and enlighten those who encountered it. In her office at the university, Dr. Chen kept a photograph of the empty cave and a translation of Cameron's letter. Sometimes she wondered about the journal, the original chronicle that Guillaume had begun in 1307, and that had grown for centuries. Where was it now? Who held it? Was there still a guardian somewhere, maintaining the ancient trust? She suspected she would never know, and perhaps that was appropriate. Some mysteries deserved to remain mysteries, not because truth should be hidden, but because the search for truth was itself valuable. The Templars had understood this. They had been, above all else, seekers, seeking not just to protect what was known, but to preserve the possibility of knowing, to keep alive the human capacity for wonder, questioning, and discovery. The real treasure, Dr. Chen realized, was not objects but ideas. It was the understanding that truth was too important to be controlled by any single institution, that knowledge belonged to humanity rather than to kings or popes, and that the greatest service one could perform was to ensure that light, however small, continued to shine through the darkness of ignorance and oppression. 700 years after Guillaume closed the cave for the first time, his mission was complete. The treasure of the Knights Templar had been found because it had never truly been lost. It had simply been waiting, patient and enduring, for the world to be ready to receive it. The Curse of the Amber Room. You've probably heard whispers about cursed treasures, the Hope Diamond, King Tut's tomb, maybe even that supposedly haunted doll your aunt keeps in her attic. But tonight, as you settle in, let me tell you about something that makes those tales seem almost quaint. The Amber Room, sometimes called the eighth wonder of the world, and the shadow of misfortune that has followed everyone who's ever gotten too close to it. Picture this. It's 1701 in Prussia, and Friedrich I has just crowned himself king. He wants something spectacular, something that will make every other European monarch green with envy. So he commissions the finest craftsmen to create a room entirely panelled in amber. Not just any amber, mind you, but 6 tons of the finest Baltic amber, backed with gold leaf and mirrors, embedded with precious stones. The amber itself ranged in colour from pale yellow to deep orange red, and when candles lit the room, it would glow like the inside of a sunset. Imagine standing in a chamber where every surface shimmers with warm, honey-coloured light, where the walls seem alive with ancient resin that once oozed from prehistoric trees. It took a decade to complete, and when it was finished, it was worth about $500 million in today's money. But here's where our story really begins. In 1716, Friedrich Wilhelm I, who inherited the throne and preferred military uniforms to fancy rooms, decided to give the Amber Room to Peter the Great of Russia as a gift to cement an alliance against Sweden. The panels were carefully dismantled, packed into 18 large boxes, and shipped to St. Petersburg. Peter was delighted, though he died before he could properly install it. His daughter, Elizabeth, eventually had it moved to the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, just outside St. Petersburg, where it was expanded to fill a larger space. For more than 2 centuries, the Amber Room remained there, dazzling visitors, surviving revolutions and regime changes, a glowing testament to Baroque excess and artistic achievement. Then came June 1941. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, and within months, German forces were pushing toward Leningrad. The Soviets knew the Catherine Palace was in danger. They tried desperately to save the Amber Room, attempting to dismantle it and pack it away, but the amber had become brittle with age. It started crumbling at the slightest touch. So instead, they tried to hide it, covering the panels with wallpaper, hoping the Germans wouldn't notice. It was a futile gesture. When the Germans arrived in September 1941, they knew exactly what they were looking for. A German art historian named Alfred Rode, who specialized in amber, was brought in. He'd been obsessed with the Amber Room for years. Within 36 hours, the Nazis had carefully dismantled what Soviet curators couldn't touch, packed it into 27 crates, and shipped it to Königsberg Castle in East Prussia, in what's now Kaliningrad, Russia. Hitler considered the Amber Room German property anyway. It had been created in Prussia, after all, and planned to display it in a massive museum complex he dreamed of building after the war. For a while, the Amber Room was actually displayed in Königsberg Castle, reassembled in a dedicated hall. Visitors came to see it, marveling at this stolen wonder. But by 1943, as the war turned against Germany and Allied bombs began falling on German cities, the castle's director ordered the room dismantled and crated up again. And this is where the trail goes cold, where history dissolves into rumour and speculation, and where the curse really seems to take hold. Alfred Rode, the amber expert who helped steal the room, died in December 1945 in a Soviet hospital. His wife died the same day. The official cause was typhus, but some wondered if it was really disease that killed them, or something else. Interrogation, perhaps, or something more mysterious. You see, Rode claimed to have hidden the amber room, but he never revealed where, if he even knew. Some say Soviet authorities questioned him too roughly, desperate for information. Others whisper that he took the secret to his grave deliberately, that the room itself had gotten into his mind somehow, made him possessive, unwilling to share. The director of Königsberg Castle, who ordered the room packed away, disappeared during the Soviet assault on the city in 1945, never seen again. Königsberg itself was bombed heavily, the castle damaged and later demolished by the Soviets in 1968. If the amber room was still there, buried in the rubble, it's now under a pile of concrete and Soviet-era buildings. But that's just the beginning of the disappearances and deaths. In 1945, a German soldier named Georg Stein claimed he helped pack the amber room into crates and knew where it was hidden. Before he could provide details, he was killed. Some say by the Soviets, others say by fellow Germans who didn't want the secret revealed. In 1959, a man in East Germany came forward, saying his father had been part of the transport team that moved the crates. He died in a car crash before he could be properly interviewed. In 1979, a German investigative journalist named Paul Encke spent years researching the Amber Room's fate. He became convinced it was hidden in a network of tunnels under Königsberg. He died suddenly of a heart attack at age 45, his research notes scattered and incomplete. In 1987, another German researcher, Georg Klemm, claimed to have new evidence about the room's location. He died in mysterious circumstances shortly after, his apartment ransacked, his files gone. The pattern continued. In 1991, during the chaos following the Soviet Union's collapse, a former Soviet intelligence officer named Yuri Gusev announced he knew where the Amber Room was hidden. He had documents, he said, maps. He was found dead in a forest outside Moscow, shot once in the head, his briefcase missing, ruled a robbery, though his expensive watch and wallet were still on his body. In 1997, German art dealer Alexander Braun tried to sell an amber mosaic that had definitely been part of the Amber Room, one of the Florentine mosaics, a small panel depicting touch and smell from a series representing the 5 senses. When police raided his home, they found the panel, proving that at least some pieces of the room had survived. But Braun claimed his father, a German lieutenant, had taken it as a souvenir during the war. Before investigators could question him thoroughly about whether his father had known the location of the rest, Braun died of cancer. The mosaic panel is now in a museum, but it only deepened the mystery. If one piece survived, where were the tons of others? Between 1979 and 2003, at least 17 people who claimed knowledge of the Amber Room's location, or who were actively searching for it, died in unusual circumstances. Heart attacks despite no history of heart disease, car accidents, mysterious falls, one drowning in calm waters. Statisticians might say this is coincidence, that people die all the time, especially people obsessed with dangerous treasure hunts, trudging through collapsed buildings and unstable tunnels. But those close to the searches began to whisper about a curse, about amber's ancient power turned dark. You see, amber isn't just fossilized resin, it's organic, once alive in a way, preserving insects and plant matter from millions of years ago. Baltic cultures have always considered amber magical, protective. They made amber amulets to ward off evil, amber rosaries for prayer, but like any powerful object, amber can be corrupted, or so the stories go. 6 tons of it, shaped into beauty and then stolen, thought over, hidden away. Perhaps it absorbed all that greed and violence, transformed from protection to punishment. The theories about the room's location are numerous and contradictory. Some believe it's still buried in Königsberg's ruins, perhaps in the castle's cellars, perhaps in nearby bunkers. Others think it was loaded onto a ship, maybe the Wilhelm Gustloff, which sank in 1945 with massive loss of life, or another vessel that went down in the Baltic Sea. There are theories about salt mines in central Germany, about Austrian mountain hideaways, about railway tunnels sealed by explosives. A few researchers think the Amber Room was destroyed in the 1945 bombing of Königsberg, burned up in the fires that ravaged the city. Amber burns, after all, releasing a sweet smell as it melts. Perhaps the eighth wonder of the world simply went up in smoke, and all the deaths since have been over nothing but ashes and memory. In 1979, the Soviet government, tired of the mystery and wanting their treasure back, commissioned a team to recreate the Amber Room from photographs and drawings. It took 24 years and cost $11 million. In 2003, the new Amber Room was unveiled in the Catherine Palace, restored to its original location. It's beautiful, absolutely stunning, and tourists come from around the world to see it. But it's not the same. The original panels had developed a patina over 3 centuries, a depth of colour and character that can't be replicated, and of course, the new room carries none of the history, none of the blood and obsession of the original. But the searches haven't stopped. Even with a replica in place, treasure hunters, historians, and amateur sleuths continue looking for the original. In 2008, a team of German researchers using ground-penetrating radar claimed to have found a hidden chamber beneath Deutschnudorf, a small town on the Czech-German border. They insisted it contained treasures from Königsberg Castle, possibly including the Amber Room. They began excavation. Nothing was found, and funding dried up. The team leader later admitted to depression and obsession, how the search had consumed his marriage, his finances, his peace of mind. In 2016, 2 men in Poland claimed they'd found a Nazi gold train in a mountain tunnel, a train that supposedly carried not just gold, but art treasures from the war. The Amber Room, they hinted, might be aboard. Using ground-penetrating radar, they showed what looked like a tunnel and something inside it. The Polish government took the claims seriously enough to investigate. Excavations found, nothing. Empty tunnels, disturbed earth, but no train, no gold, no amber. The 2 men stuck to their story, claiming they'd been misled by their equipment, or perhaps that someone else had gotten there first. Both experienced financial ruin from the failed expedition. One divorced, the other was sued by investors. They spoke in interviews about sleepless nights, about dreams of glowing amber panels just out of reach, about a compulsion they couldn't explain or shake. This is what the Amber Room seems to do to people. It gets inside their heads. Rational individuals become obsessed, lose perspective, stake everything on finding it. There's a psychological term for this kind of fixation, but it doesn't quite capture what happens to Amber Room seekers. They don't just want to find it. They need to, as if the room itself is calling to them across time and space, promising glory, wealth, vindication. And then something goes wrong. Always something goes wrong. Consider the Russian archaeologist Andrei Vorobiev, who in 2010 announced he'd pinpointed the room's location using newly declassified Soviet military documents. He claimed it was in a flooded mine shaft in Saxony, Germany. He assembled a team, secured permits, began pumping out water. 3 weeks into the project, there was an accident. A support beam collapsed. Vorobiev survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down. The mine flooded again before any search could be completed. From his wheelchair, Vorobiev later said he regretted ever hearing about the amber room, that he wished he'd listened to his wife, who'd had nightmares about amber burning while he drowned. Or think about the British historian Trevor Stevens, who in 2013 wrote a book claiming the amber room was destroyed in 1945, that everyone searching for it was chasing a ghost. He argued persuasively, using documentary evidence, eyewitness accounts, and scientific analysis of amber's fragility. His book sold well. He seemed to have put the mystery to rest. Then, 6 months after publication, he recanted everything in a rambling blog post, saying he'd been wrong, that the room survived and he now knew where it was. His publisher was baffled. His colleagues worried about his mental state. He disappeared into the forests of Kaliningrad Oblast, searching. Russian authorities found him 3 weeks later, dehydrated and delirious, digging with his bare hands in frozen ground. He had no memory of those weeks, couldn't explain what had driven him there. The stories pile up like this, dozens of them, maybe hundreds if you count everyone who spent significant time hunting the amber room or claiming knowledge of it. Not all of them die or suffer catastrophe, but the percentage is high enough to make you wonder. Statistical anomaly? Mass hysteria? Or is there something about this particular treasure that invites disaster? Amber itself has properties that science doesn't fully understand. It generates static electricity when rubbed, which ancient peoples noticed and attributed to magical qualities. It can preserve DNA across millions of years. Scientists have extracted viable genetic material from insects trapped in amber, a fact that inspired Jurassic Park. Some researchers believe amber emits low levels of electromagnetic radiation. Could 6 tons of it, packed together for decades, then scattered and hidden, create some kind of field that affects those who get close? It sounds absurd, like pseudoscience, but people who've spent time near large collections of amber sometimes report headaches, vivid dreams, a buzzing sensation. More likely, the curse is purely human. Greed, obsession, the toxic combination of hope and desperation that makes people take foolish risks. The amber room represents the ultimate treasure hunt, valuable beyond measure, lost under dramatic circumstances, tantalizing clues scattered everywhere and nowhere. It's the perfect hook for the human imagination. And once hooked, people destroy themselves, neglecting families and careers, spending money they don't have, venturing into dangerous places, trusting the wrong people. The curse isn't supernatural, it's psychological. The amber doesn't need to be haunted to ruin lives. The mere idea of it is enough. But then there are the coincidences that are hard to explain away. The number of researchers who've died right before planned announcements about the room's location. The way critical evidence keeps disappearing. Documents burned in house fires, computers stolen, witnesses dying before they can testify. It's possible this is just bad luck compounded over decades, but it's also possible that someone or multiple someones are actively working to keep the amber room hidden. Perhaps they know where it is and are protecting it. Perhaps they're guarding it for the right moment to reveal it. Or perhaps they know it was destroyed and are maintaining the mystery for their own purposes. To sell fake maps, to keep grant money flowing, to preserve the legend that brings tourism and book sales and documentary deals. There's a darker theory One that sounds like conspiracy but has some circumstantial support. That the KGB and later the FSB have known the room's location since the 1940s and have deliberately eliminated anyone who got too close to finding it. Why? Perhaps because the Amber Room's actual location would reveal something embarrassing. That Soviet forces destroyed it themselves during the assault on Königsberg, or that Soviet officers looted and sold it piece by piece on the black market. Or perhaps Russian intelligence simply enjoys having this mystery, this cultural wound that keeps Germany and Russia connected through shared loss, a bargaining chip that might prove useful someday. The evidence for this theory is thin. Mostly the suspicious deaths of Soviet citizens who claimed knowledge and the way Russian authorities sometimes seem to know more than they're saying. But in Russia's murky world of state secrets and intelligence operations, it's not entirely implausible. Or maybe the answer is simpler and sadder. The Amber Room is gone. Fire consumed it, or it shattered when bombs hit, or it was broken up and sold off in pieces too small to identify. The one surviving panel, that Florentine mosaic, might be all that remains. Everything else, ash, fragments, dust. The deaths and disasters associated with finding it are just the normal toll of dangerous obsession, no different from the casualties of any gold rush or treasure fever. The curse is what we call it, when people refuse to accept loss, when they can't let go of beauty that's passed beyond recovery. But you're lying here in the dark, and I'm telling you this story, and maybe you're wondering, what if it's real? What if those amber panels are still out there, packed in crates in some forgotten chamber, waiting? What if the room itself, created to dazzle and impress, has developed a kind of consciousness, a hunger to be found that reaches out and touches susceptible minds? It sounds ridiculous in daylight, but here in the quiet hours, with sleep pressing close, maybe it doesn't seem so impossible. After all, we barely understand consciousness in humans. Who's to say that 6 tons of organic amber arranged in deliberate patterns, infused with centuries of awe and violence, couldn't develop some kind of awareness? The last credible search happened in 2020, right before the pandemic shut everything down. A team of Polish and German researchers, using advanced AI to analyze wartime documents and photographs, claimed they'd identified a pattern in Nazi shipping records that pointed to a specific location, a sealed tunnel system near the town of Wałbrzych in Poland. They announced they'd begin excavation in spring 2020. Then COVID-19 hit. The project was postponed, then the funding fell through. Then the team's lead researcher, a German professor named Klaus Zimmermann, died of COVID-19 complications at age 52. The project hasn't resumed. Zimmermann's AI algorithm was on his personal computer, which his family couldn't unlock. His research notes were in a storage unit that flooded during a storm, destroying everything. Another dead end, another life consumed by amber. So where is the Amber Room now? The truth is, no one knows. It might be in Kaliningrad's ruins, buried under concrete and time. It might be at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, inside a rusted ship that will never be found. It might be in a salt mine, a bunker, a collapsed tunnel, a forgotten warehouse. Or it might exist only in photographs and memories now, its physical form scattered beyond recovery, but its legend growing stronger every year. What we do know is this: people will keep looking. The mystery is too alluring, the prize too magnificent, the possibility too tantalizing. Someone else will come forward with new evidence, new technology, new theories. They'll assemble a team, secure funding, begin excavation, And maybe, just maybe, they'll be the lucky ones who finally find it. Or maybe they'll join the long list of those who got too close to the amber and paid the price. There's a Russian curator at the Catherine Palace, an elderly woman who is part of the team that built the replica Amber Room. She gives tours sometimes, telling visitors about the original, its creation, its theft, its loss. She always ends with the same statement, spoken softly. The Amber Room doesn't want to be found. It had its time, its glory, and now it rests. We should let it sleep. When asked if she believes the curse is real, she smiles sadly and says, "I believe obsession is real, and that's curse enough." Maybe she's right. Maybe the real curse isn't supernatural at all. It's simply human nature, our inability to accept that some beautiful things are gone forever, our compulsion to chase what we've lost, even when the chase destroys us. The Amber Room was created to showcase wealth and power, to make people gasp in wonder. It succeeded brilliantly, and when it vanished, it became something even more powerful, an eternal mystery, a golden thread running through history, connecting everyone who's ever dreamed of finding it. Perhaps that's the room's final triumph, its ultimate purpose, not to be seen and admired in a static location, but to move through time as an idea, inspiring and destroying in equal measure, forever just out of reach, forever glowing in our imaginations like candlelight through honey-colored resin. The panels might be gone, but the Amber Room itself lives on, more present in its absence than it ever was in its reality. And as long as people keep searching, keep dying, keep dreaming of that impossible golden glow, the room continues to exist, not in any physical space, but in the dangerous territory between hope and obsession, where all curses are born and fed. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of those amber panels, wherever they are. Think of them glowing softly in the dark, waiting, patient as stone, hungry as legend, and be glad you're only hearing about them, not searching for them. Some treasures are better left lost. Some mysteries are safer unsolved. The Amber Room has claimed enough lives already. Let it keep its secrets. Let it rest in whatever darkness holds it now, and let us rest too, here in the safety of distance, content to wonder but wise enough not to seek. That might be the only way to break the curse, to simply stop looking, to let the amber sleep undisturbed, glowing only in stories told on quiet nights like this, beautiful and deadly and forever, just beyond our reach.